I've always found the woods at 4 in the morning to be the most honest version of nature, where the world is just a series of cold shadows and the biting scent of wet pine needles. There is a specific kind of silence that settles over the Georgia backcountry during the late autumn, a heavy, damp quiet that feels like the forest is holding its breath in anticipation of the sun. I had parked my truck nearly 2 miles back, preferring to hike into the deep brush where the wild boars tend to congregate near the Blackwater creeks. My pack was heavy, the straps digging into my shoulders with a familiar, grounding pressure, and my rifle felt like a natural extension of my arm as I navigated by the dim, red glow of my headlamp. Solo hunting is something most people around here advise against, citing the rugged terrain or the unpredictable nature of a cornered hog, but I've always preferred the solitude. There is no one to whisper to, no one to accidentally kick a dry branch, just me and the slow, rhythmic thumping of my own heart. I reached my favorite spot, a natural ridge overlooking a low-lying thicket of scrub oaks and tangled briars, just as the sky began to bleed into a bruised shade of purple. I settled in against the trunk of an ancient, gnarled oak, feeling the rough bark through my thick hunting jacket as I prepared for the long wait. The first hour passed in total stillness, the kind of stillness that allows you to hear the blood rushing in your ears and the distant, muffled sound of the creek. I checked my windage, noting that the breeze was faint but steady, blowing directly into my face, which was perfect for keeping my scent hidden from any approaching game. It was around 6:15 a.m. when I heard the first anomaly, a sound that didn't quite fit the symphony of the waking forest. It wasn't the sharp crack of a breaking limb, which usually signals a heavy animal, but rather a soft, wet thud, like a heavy bag of flour being dropped onto moss. I froze, my finger resting lightly near the safety of my .308, and I scanned the grayscale horizon of the thicket below. Nothing moved, but the birds that had been chirping tentatively a few moments ago suddenly went dead silent, leaving the woods in an oppressive vacuum of sound. I told myself it was likely just a falling branch or perhaps a large owl landing poorly, though the explanation felt thin even in my own mind. I waited 10 minutes, my eyes straining against the dim light, until a secondary sound drifted up from the base of the ridge. It was a low, rhythmic rasping, almost like someone drawing a serrated blade across a piece of dry leather. I shifted my weight ever so slightly, the dry leaves beneath me making a microscopic crunch that felt like a gunshot in the vacuum of the morning. The rasping stopped instantly, and for a long moment, the only thing I could hear was the frantic drumming of a woodpecker somewhere deep in the pines. I laughed at myself internally, chalking the tension up to a lack of sleep and the way the fog can play tricks on your hearing by echoing sounds in strange directions. I decided to move further down the ridge to get a better vantage point on the creek, thinking the boars might be sticking closer to the water than usual. As I descended, I noticed a patch of churned up earth that looked like a fresh hog wallow, but as I knelt to examine it, I realized the marks weren't right. Instead of the sharp, cloven hoof prints of a feral pig, the mud was pressed flat in wide, oblong shapes that looked disturbingly like a barefoot human print, though far too narrow. I stood up quickly, my skin prickling with a sudden, localized chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. I scanned the trees again, looking for the orange vest of another hunter who might have wandered onto this private land. But the woods remained a monotonous palette of gray and brown. I began to walk toward the creek, keeping my footsteps light, but every time I stopped to listen, I could hear a faint echo of my own movement trailing behind me. It wasn't a perfect synchronization. It was as if something was miming my pace but failing to match the rhythm by just a fraction of a second. I turned around abruptly, bringing my rifle up to my shoulder in a fluid motion, but the trail behind me was empty, just the swaying skeletons of the underbrush. "Hello!" I called out, my voice sounding thin and brittle against the vastness of the timberland, but no one answered. I told myself I was being hunted by a mountain lion, even though they aren't supposed to be this far east, because a predator made more sense than the creeping dread in my stomach. I reached the edge of the creek, where the water was black and sluggish, reflecting the overcast sky like a sheet of obsidian. On a flat rock near the water's edge, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A small pile of polished stones arranged in a perfect, unnatural circle. In the center of the circle sat a single, rusted brass casing from a .308, the exact caliber I was carrying in my rifle. My heart began to race as I realized the casing was still warm to the touch, as if it had been sitting in someone's pocket or hand moments before. I looked around wildly, realizing that the brush on the opposite bank was thick enough to hide a dozen men, or something else entirely. I decided then that the hunt was over and began to backtrack toward my truck, maintaining a brisk but controlled pace to avoid looking like prey. The sounds behind me didn't stop. In fact, they became more brazen, with the heavy thudding and the leather rasping sound occurring more frequently. I didn't look back again, focused entirely on the path ahead, but I could feel a gaze burning into the back of my neck with a physical weight. I reached a clearing about a mile from my truck when I saw a movement in my peripheral vision, a flash of something pale and spindly darting behind a cedar tree. It didn't move like a person or a pig. It moved with a jerky, hitching gait like a marionette being pulled by someone with shaking hands. I didn't stop to investigate, my instinct for self-preservation finally overriding my curiosity and my pride. I broke into a jog, my gear rattling against my frame, and the sound of something heavy following suit in the brush parallel to the trail. Every time I glanced to the side, I saw nothing but the blur of trees, but the snapping of branches was getting closer, moving from 30 yards out to 20, then 10. I reached the final stretch of the logging road that led to my truck, and the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long, distorted shadows across the gravel. I fumbled for my keys in my pocket, my fingers trembling so violently that I nearly dropped them twice. I reached the driver's side door and yanked it open, throwing my rifle onto the passenger seat and diving inside in one frantic motion. As I slammed the door and locked it, I finally looked out the window toward the tree line I had just emerged from. Standing just at the edge of the shadows was a figure, though calling it a man felt like a generous interpretation of what I was seeing. It was draped in a suit made of cured, blackened animal hides that were stitched together with what looked like rusted wire, making it appear bulky and inhuman. The creature wasn't wearing a mask. Instead, its face was covered in a thick layer of gray wood ash, and it stood perfectly still, watching me with eyes that were wide and unblinking. It didn't move toward the truck. It simply stood there, holding a long, sharpened pole that had a clump of my own hair tied to the top with a piece of orange flagging tape. I realized then that the thudding I had heard earlier was this thing jumping from tree to tree, following me from above while I looked at the ground. I cranked the engine, the roar of the truck feeling like a shield between me and the nightmare at the edge of the woods. I didn't look back as I floored it down the logging road, the tires kicking up a massive cloud of red dust that obscured the rearview mirror. I drove for an hour without stopping, finally pulling into a brightly lit gas station where the mundane reality of coffee and lottery tickets felt like a different universe. I reached into the back seat to grab my phone to call the sheriff, but my hand brushed against something cold and wet on the floor mat. I looked down and saw a single, fresh boar's heart lying there, still glistening with moisture, right where I had placed my pack earlier. I realized with a sickening jolt that the truck had been locked when I arrived that morning, and I had been carrying my only set of keys the entire time. There was no way for anyone to get inside while I was in the woods, unless they were already in the truck when I drove there. I looked at the heart, then at the empty back seat, realizing that the creature hadn't just been stalking me in the forest. I thought about the 2-mile hike back to the truck and how long I had been away from the vehicle, giving someone plenty of time to wait. I looked at the passenger seat where my rifle lay, and my blood turned to ice when I noticed the safety was now clicked to off. I haven't been back to those woods, and I sold that truck a week later, but sometimes at night, I hear a soft, wet thud on the roof of my house. I don't go outside to check anymore, because I know that some things in the woods aren't looking for animals. I think about the clump of hair on that pole every time I brush my own, wondering how close he really got while I was sitting against that oak tree. The police found nothing at the ridge, no signs of a camp or a struggle, just a circle of stones that had been swept away by the wind. I still have the .308 casing, though I don't know why I kept it, other than as a reminder that the woods are never truly empty. Every time I see a person in a gray sweatshirt or a smudge of ash, my heart skips a beat and my hand goes to my pocket. The silence of the morning doesn't feel honest to me anymore. It feels like a mask, and I know deep down that he didn't want the boar and he didn't want the truck. He just wanted me to know that he could have taken me at any second he chose. I still haven't figured out why he didn't. I've been hunting the North Ridge for nearly 15 years, and I've never once felt like I was being watched by anything other than the deer. My dad built the Old Crow blind back in the late 90s. A sturdy cedar plank box perched 10 feet up a massive oak tree overlooking a natural funnel in the valley. It's a 3-mile hike from the nearest fire road, through thickets of briars and over a creek that stays ice cold even in the humid belly of July. I usually make the trek in the pitch black of 4 a.m., guided only by the narrow beam of my headlamp and the rhythmic crunch of frosted leaves beneath my boots. This year, the air felt particularly heavy, the kind of stillness that makes you think the woods are holding their breath for something to happen. I reached the base of the oak around 4:45, my breath coming in ragged plumes of white steam that vanished into the darkness above. The ladder is made of rusted rebar rungs bolted directly into the trunk, and they always groan a little under my weight, a familiar sound that usually brings me a sense of comfort. I hauled my Remington 700 up on a pull rope, the metal cold against my palms, and unlatched the heavy wooden door of the blind. Inside, it smelled of dry cedar and the faint, lingering scent of the peppermint oil I used to keep the mice away during the off-season. I settled into the old swivel chair, the one with the cracked vinyl seat that squeaks if you shift your weight too fast. Everything seemed perfectly normal at first, just the way I'd left it 2 weeks prior when I came up to clear the shooting lanes. I sat there in the dark for an hour, waiting for the first gray light of dawn to bleed through the canopy and reveal the valley floor. As the shadows began to pull back, I noticed something small resting on the narrow shelf where I usually keep my binoculars. It was a single, perfectly round pebble, white as a knuckle bone and polished so smooth it almost looked like marble. I didn't think much of it, assuming a squirrel or a bird might have dragged it in, though how they'd find a river stone that high up was a question I dismissed for later. I flicked it out the window and watched it disappear into the brush below, focusing back on the clearing. Around 7:30, the wind shifted, bringing a scent that didn't belong in the deep woods. A sharp, metallic tang mixed with something sickly sweet, like rotting peaches. I leaned forward, sniffing the air, wondering if a deer had died nearby or if a coyote had made a kill just out of sight. That's when I noticed the floorboards beneath my feet felt slightly different. A subtle vibration that wasn't caused by the wind hitting the structure. It was a rhythmic, low-frequency pulse, so faint I could only feel it through the soles of my heavy hunting boots. I reached down to adjust my gear bag, and my hand brushed against the edge of the seat cushion. The vinyl was warm. Not just room temperature warm, but body heat warm, as if someone had been sitting in that chair seconds before I climbed through the door. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck begin to prickle. I looked around the tiny 6x6 box, searching for any other sign that I wasn't alone, but the walls were solid and the door was latched from the inside. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, that the sun hitting the dark vinyl earlier might have warmed it, even though the sun hadn't even topped the ridge yet. I went back to scanning the woods, but my focus was shattered, my eyes darting to every shadow and every knot in the wood. About 20 minutes later, I heard it, a soft, wet clicking sound coming from directly beneath the floorboards. It sounded like someone was tapping 2 wet stones together, or perhaps clicking their teeth in a slow, deliberate cadence. I froze, holding my breath until my lungs burned, listening with every fiber of my being. The sound stopped, followed by a long, drawn-out sigh that seemed to vibrate the very boards I was standing on. There isn't supposed to be a crawl space under the Old Crow. It's built on a platform of 4x4s bolted to the tree limbs. I slowly stood up, my rifle gripped tightly in my hands, and knelt down to examine the floor. Near the back corner, behind where I store my extra heater fuel, I saw a gap in the planks that I didn't remember being there. The wood looked like it had been shaved down, the edges fresh and blonde against the weathered gray of the rest of the floor. I reached out a trembling hand and hooked my fingers into the gap, pulling upward with a sharp, desperate jerk. A small section of the floor, about a foot square, lifted away easily, revealing a dark, hollowed-out space tucked between the platform and the tree trunk. The smell hit me first, a concentrated blast of that copper and rot, so thick it made my eyes water and my stomach churn. I pulled out my small tactical flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting a jagged hole into the darkness below. At first, I only saw rags, layers and layers of stained burlap and old camouflage netting that had been stitched together with fishing line. Then the light caught something shiny, and I realized the entire floor of the hidden compartment was lined with thousands of those white, polished river stones. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I moved the light further back into the recess. There, tucked into the very corner of the hollow, was a small, tattered notebook with my name written on the cover in a shaky, erratic hand. I didn't want to touch it, but the compulsion was stronger than the fear, and I reached down to retrieve the damp, moldy pages. It wasn't a diary. It was a logbook, filled with dates and times spanning back the last 3 years of my hunting trips. October 12th, 5:12 a.m., he arrived. Blue jacket today. Coffee smells like cinnamon. November 4th, 6:30 p.m., he stayed late. I touched his boot while he slept. I felt a wave of cold nausea wash over me as I realized someone had been living literally inches beneath me for years, watching me through the cracks in the floor. I dropped the notebook back into the hole, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped the flashlight too. As I moved to pull my hand back, the light swept across the very edge of the compartment, illuminating a pair of eyes. They were wide, unblinking, and sunken deep into a face that looked more like stretched parchment than human skin. He was pressed flat against the underside of the floorboards, his body contorted into a shape that shouldn't have been possible for a grown man. He didn't scream, and he didn't move. He just stared at me with an expression of intense, starving curiosity. I scrambled backward, my boot catching on the swivel chair and sending it crashing against the far wall with a deafening bang. The man in the hole let out a low, melodic hum, a sound so eerily calm that it terrified me more than a roar would have. I didn't grab my gear. I just threw myself at the door and fumbled with the latch, my fingers feeling like lead. I burst out onto the small landing, nearly falling over the railing in my haste to get to the ladder. I practically fell down the rebar rungs, skinning my palms and shins on the rough metal, but I didn't feel the pain. When my feet hit the forest floor, I didn't look back. I just ran, my rifle forgotten in the blind, my only goal to reach the fire road. The woods felt different now, no longer a sanctuary, but a labyrinth designed to keep me trapped within its borders. Every snap of a twig sounded like a footstep behind me, and every rustle of the wind felt like a hand reaching for my collar. I crashed through the creek, the freezing water soaking my boots, and scrambled up the muddy bank on the other side. I reached my truck 20 minutes later, my lungs burning and my vision blurring at the edges from the sheer exertion. I fumbled my keys into the ignition and tore out of there, the tires throwing gravel as I sped down the narrow dirt track. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, where the presence of streetlights and other cars offered a thin, fragile sense of safety. I drove straight to the county sheriff's office, my clothes soaked in sweat and creek water, my face probably pale as a ghost. The deputy at the desk looked at me like I was insane as I stammered out the story, trying to explain the notebook and the man under the floor. They sent 2 officers up there later that afternoon, and I waited in the station, nursing a cup of black coffee that I couldn't bring myself to drink. When they came back 3 hours later, their expressions were grim and confused. They found the blind, and they found the hidden compartment, but the space was empty. The burlap rags were there, and the river stones were there, but the notebook was gone. They found my rifle exactly where I'd left it, leaning against the wall, but the bolt had been removed and was nowhere to be found. One of the deputies pulled me aside and asked if I was sure about the notebook, because they found something else tucked into the corner of the hollow. He held up a small plastic evidence bag containing a lock of hair tied with a piece of dirty twine. It was gray and coarse, looking exactly like the hair from my own head that I'd seen in the barber's mirror just a week before. I haven't been back to the North Ridge since then, and I don't think I ever will. I sold my gear, gave away my remaining rifles, and tried to settle back into a life that didn't involve the silence of the woods. But the fear hasn't left me. It's just changed its shape, moving from the forest into the corners of my everyday life. A month ago, I found a small, white river stone sitting on my bedside table when I woke up. I live on the 3rd floor of an apartment building in the city, and I keep my doors locked at all times. I checked the locks, checked the windows, and found no sign of entry, but the stone was there, cold and smooth against my palm. Last week, I started hearing that same wet clicking sound coming from the ventilation duct in my bedroom. It only happens in the dead of night, usually around 3 o'clock or 4 a.m., the same time I used to start my hike to the blind. I called the landlord, and he sent a maintenance guy to check the ducts, but he found nothing but dust and a few dead spiders. He told me the building is old and the pipes often rattle, but I know what a rattling pipe sounds like, and it doesn't sound like teeth. 2 days ago, I was looking through some old photos on my phone, trying to find a picture of my dad. I came across a selfie I'd taken in the hunting blind 3 years ago. A silly picture of me drinking coffee and smiling at the camera. I zoomed in on the background, looking at the cedar planks behind my head. There, in the narrow gap between 2 boards near the floor, I could see the faint glint of an eye reflecting the camera's flash. He had been there the whole time, inches away, watching me live my life while he sat in the dark with his stones. I don't sleep much anymore, and when I do, I dream of the old crow and the smell of rotting peaches. I moved to a different apartment, one with better security and no visible vents in the bedroom, but it didn't help. This morning, I found my front door slightly ajar when I got up to get a glass of water. I know I locked it because I've developed a ritual of checking the deadbolt 3 times before I lay down. On the kitchen counter, arranged in a neat, perfect circle, were 12 white river stones. In the center of the circle was the bolt from my Remington 700, the metal cleaned of all its oil and polished until it shone. I called the police again, but without any signs of forced entry or a struggle. They told me there wasn't much they could do besides file a report. They suggested I look into a security system, which I did, but the cameras showed nothing but an empty hallway all night long. It's as if he knows exactly where the blind spots are, as if he spent years studying how to move without being seen. I'm sitting in my living room now, the lights turned up as high as they can go, clutching a kitchen knife that feels woefully inadequate. The sun is starting to set, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floorboards of my apartment. I can feel a faint vibration coming from the floor, a rhythmic pulse that matches the beating of my own heart. I know he's close, and I know he's not going away, because he spent too much time being part of my life to stop now. He isn't a ghost, and he isn't a monster. He's just a man who decided that I was the person he wanted to watch. I often wonder what he did before he found my blind, or if there are other hunters out there with someone tucked beneath their feet. Maybe that's why the woods feel so heavy sometimes, not because of the trees or the animals, but because of the people hidden in the spaces we don't look. I hear the clicking again, louder this time, coming from the space behind the drywall in the corner of the room. It's a slow, deliberate sound, almost like a greeting or a countdown. I've started leaving a light on in every room, but the shadows just seem to get deeper in the places the light can't reach. I bought a new gun, a handgun this time, but I'm afraid to use it, afraid that I'll miss and give him the opening he's been waiting for. I sometimes find myself looking at my own reflection and wondering if he's looking at it too, from somewhere just out of sight. The air in here is starting to smell like copper and unwashed laundry again, no matter how much air freshener I spray. I tried to go to a hotel, but I found a white stone in the pocket of my suitcase when I unpacked. There is no running from someone who has already moved into the foundation of your life. I think back to that logbook and the entry about him touching my boot while I slept in the blind. I wonder if he's touched me since then, while I was asleep in my own bed, dreaming of being safe. The clicking is rhythmic now, almost like a heartbeat, and I can hear that low, melodic humming starting to drift through the wall. I'm not going to look behind the drywall, and I'm not going to check the vents anymore. I'm just going to sit here in the light and wait for the sun to come up, even though I know the dawn won't save me. Because even when the sun is out, the space beneath the floor is always dark. The air in the Blackwood Valley at 2 in the morning has a way of pressing against your lungs. A heavy, damp cold that smells of rotting pine needles and the metallic tang of an approaching frost. I've been hunting these woods since I was 16, so the total absence of light doesn't usually bother me, especially when I have the familiar weight of my Matthews bow slung over my shoulder and the rhythmic crunch of my own boots to keep me company. This particular trip was supposed to be a quiet, solitary overnight stay in my favorite oak bottom stand. A place so remote that you have to hike 3 miles past the old logging road just to see the first trail marker. I like the isolation because it usually means the deer aren't spooked, but as I moved deeper into the thicket, the silence felt different, less like a peaceful void and more like a held breath. My headlamp was dimmed to a low red glow to preserve my night vision, casting long, bloody shadows across the twisted roots and skeletal branches of the undergrowth. I reached my stand around 2:45 a.m., the metal ladder freezing to the touch even through my heavy camo gloves, and I climbed up with the practiced movements of someone who has done this 1,000 times. Once I was settled 10 feet up, I hooked my safety harness to the tree and began the long, meditative process of waiting for the pre-dawn movement. The woods were unervingly still, lacking even the usual rustle of squirrels or the distant hoot of a barred owl that typically defines the midnight hours. About an hour into my sit, I heard the first sound that didn't belong. A sharp, rhythmic tapping, like someone hitting a hollow pipe with a stone, coming from the direction of the creek. I dismissed it as a loose branch knocking against a deadfall, because the mind has a way of rationalizing things when you're alone in the dark. 10 minutes later, the tapping started again, but this time it was closer, maybe 50 yards out, and it had a distinct cadence to it that felt disturbingly intentional. I gripped the riser of my bow, my knuckles aching from the cold, and scanned the darkness with my eyes, though I saw nothing but the gray outlines of the trees. A strange, sour smell drifted on the wind, something like old grease and wet copper, cutting through the clean scent of the forest. I reached for my rangefinder to use its thermal overlay, but as I brought it to my eye, I realized the battery was dead, which was impossible because I had charged it fully the night before. That was the first time a genuine prickle of dread crawled up my spine, a cold needle of intuition telling me that the environment had shifted from a sanctuary into a trap. I decided to stay perfectly still, hoping that whatever was making the noise would pass me by, but then I heard a low, wet cough coming from directly beneath my stand. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I was sure the tree was vibrating, yet I forced myself to look down over the edge of the platform. There was nothing there, just the matted leaves and the dark soil, but the smell of grease was suddenly overwhelming, almost suffocating in its intensity. I reached into my pocket for my phone to check the time, but my hand brushed against something cold and wet that didn't belong in my jacket. I pulled it out, and under the faint red light of my headlamp, I saw a small, perfectly carved wooden whistle shaped like a human finger. I didn't put it there, and the realization that someone had been close enough to slip something into my pocket while I was hiking in made the air turn to ice in my throat. I stood up slowly, my bow at the ready, though I knew a hunting arrow was a poor defense against an unseen intruder who could move like a ghost. From the darkness to my left, a voice whispered my name, not in a shout or a hiss, but in a conversational tone that sounded exactly like my own voice. I froze, my thumb resting on the release, my eyes searching the shadows until I saw a pale shape leaning against a tree 20 feet away. It wasn't a monster or a spirit, but a man wearing a tattered version of the same camo jacket I had on, his face obscured by a thick layer of gray mud. He wasn't holding a weapon, but he was holding a small digital camera, the red recording light blinking like a dying star in the gloom. He didn't move toward me. He just stood there, watching me with an expression of intense, clinical curiosity that made my skin crawl. I tried to speak, to ask him who he was or what he wanted, but my throat felt like it was filled with sand. He pointed a muddy finger toward the base of my tree, and when I looked down, I saw a circle of small, white objects arranged in a perfect ring around the trunk. They were teeth, hundreds of them, all human, pushed into the dirt like tiny, jagged tombstones. I didn't wait to see more. I unhooked my harness with trembling fingers and practically fell down the ladder, landing hard on the frozen ground. I didn't look back at the man. I just ran, crashing through the brush with no regard for noise or direction, my only goal being the distant logging road. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, I could hear the rhythmic tapping following me, always the same distance away, no matter how fast I moved. I reached my truck as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, my lungs burning and my vision blurring from exhaustion. I fumbled with my keys, threw my bow into the truck bed, and peeled out of the dirt turnout, the tires spitting gravel into the woods. It wasn't until I was 20 miles away, sitting in a brightly lit gas station parking lot, that I noticed the camera roll notification on my phone. I opened the app and found a dozen photos taken over the last 3 hours, all from the perspective of someone standing directly behind me in the tree stand. The last photo was taken from inches away, showing the back of my head while I was looking down at the circle of teeth. In the reflection of my own truck window, I saw a small, mud-smeared piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. I got out and grabbed it, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it, and unfolded the sheet. It wasn't a note, but a map of my own house, with a small red X marked over the window of my bedroom. I haven't been back to those woods since, and I sold my bow a week later, but the tapping started again last night, coming from the crawl space right beneath my bed. I know if I look under the house, I'll find that circle of teeth, and I know that when I finally fall asleep, he'll be there to take the next photo. The police said there were no signs of a break-in, but I found a wooden whistle on my nightstand this morning. It's carved into the shape of a finger, and this time the fingernail matches mine perfectly. I'm sitting in the living room now with all the lights on, but the grease smell is getting stronger, and I can hear someone whistling my favorite song from the hallway. I thought I was the hunter, but I was just the only one who didn't know the season had already started. The woods are quiet now, but the house is starting to feel very, very small. I can hear the tapping on the floorboards again, rhythmic and patient, counting down the seconds until the sun goes down. He's been here the whole time watching me write this, and I can feel his breath on the back of my neck right now. Don't go hunting at midnight, because some things in the woods are just waiting for a chance to follow you home. I can see the red recording light reflecting in the TV screen now, and it's getting closer. It's almost time for the final photo. I hope it's a good one,